This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This is an episode in an ongoing series co-sponsored by the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, and I am delighted to be joined again by my brother-in-arms, Professor David N. Myers, who holds the Kahn Chair. Professor Myers is a distinguished professor of Jewish history, as well as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. Hi, David. Good to have you back.
Great to be with you, Gilad.
Our guest today is an American journalist who, among many other things, has served on the editorial board of Dissent magazine. He's a contributor to the Guardian newspaper, the New York Review of Books, and other publications, as well as a PhD candidate in Jewish history at Yale. His first book, Tablets Shattered: The End of an American Jewish Century and the Future of Jewish Life, has just been published by Dutton Penguin Random House. Joshua Leifer, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So, as you show in the book, the American Jewish community is exceptionally and uniquely diverse, which has also led to many different interpretations of that phrase, the Jewish American century, referring to the golden age of the 20th century. Can you briefly explain how you understand it and how it served as a premise to your book?
I think I meant the phrase American Jewish century in a few different ways. I mean, one was just I needed a way of conceptualizing the time period that I was going to be writing about. And it occurred to me that there was roughly a century between 2024, which is when the book is coming out, and 1924, which is roughly when the largest wave of Jewish migration to America ended because of immigration restrictions that were adopted by the United States. And within that century, it seemed to me that that was when most of what we know of as American Jewish culture, literature, and identity took shape. Obviously, there's an American Jewish story that precedes 1924 or precedes the turn of the 20th century, but it seemed to me that whatever it is we mean when we talk about Jewish identity and culture, in a kind of colloquial sense, we mainly refer to things that developed during that period.
Your book is many things. It's a history of 20th century Jews, especially in America. It's a cri de coeur. It's a kind of cry in the wilderness. It's a manifesto. It's also a family memoir. And I want to just pick up on that last quality of it because the book really narrates the winding path of your own family over the course of the 20th century, concluding with your own journey. And so I wonder if you can discuss some of the paths followed by your family, beginning with religious traditionalism, and then secularism, and then Israelism, and then left-wing politics, and then, in your case, neo-traditionalism.
Yeah, I think out of luck, I guess, the line of my family that I follow in the book mapped onto a lot of different changes that I think many other American Jewish families went through. And so the book begins with my great-grandmother, Bessie, who was born in the small town of Luban, which was a smaller shtetl as part of the larger town of Slutsk, and which is in what is now Belarus. And her family was linked to the broader community around the Mir Yeshiva. And so she came from sort of the heartlands of European Haredi Judaism and then moved to the United States. This is sort of the classic Lower East Side story where she moved there with one of her sisters. Over the course of her life, she ends up moving to the Bronx, where my grandmother is born. My grandmother, or my bubby as I knew her, kind of lives the second generation classic story of rebellion against her religious upbringing and religious authority. She is very much a part of the Yiddish socialist milieu. She meets my grandfather as counselors at Camp Kindering, which is the sleepaway camp of the Arbiter Ring, the Workman's Circle. It's also where my father goes to camp as a child, and they leave behind the religious traditionalism that my great-grandmother had brought with her from Europe. And then my father, who is born in 1960, kind of lives through the transformation of post-war American Judaism. He remembers 1967. He's bar mitzvahed the year of the Yom Kippur War, and his life is totally transformed by what happens to what I call mainline American Judaism during that time. Israel is everything, and I include this story in the book of he and his parents go to Israel sometime after 1967, and this is before the apparatus of the military occupation in the West Bank has been set up, and he's going all around on this bus. And I wasn't able to include in the book. There are amazing pictures that are on slides of the family sort of in the occupied territories. And then, he and my mom met through a mutual friend whose father was the cantor at sort of the big conservative shul in New Rochelle. And they're sort of exiles from the Upper West Side in suburban New Jersey, but that was sort of the milieu that the cultural milieu that I was brought up in, and they sent me to a day school that closed, but that was very much technically affiliated with the conservative movement. But I would say that it was a very strange beast politically, probably to the right of where the conservative movement was. It was mostly Israelis, actually, because I grew up in northern New Jersey, and so it was a place where like the Jewish agency shlichim sent their children, and it was a very Zionist place. And so then the book, that was the world that I was raised in, where I include this in the introduction, where we sang Hatikva, the Pledge of Allegiance, and then Daven Shacharis. That was the ideological milieu.
But it is interesting that despite all these meanders, essentially all roads lead to Israel, because the last three generations that you described, your Bobe, your dad, and then you, all grew up, or at least at some point reverted to that Israel ritual, if you will.
Yeah, I think that in this way, I maybe am different than people whose families had contact with the secular Yiddishist tradition, but then stayed loyal to it. By which I mean to say that I think it was very clear to my Bubby that secular Yiddish culture was not a living one. She was a person who had experienced that, but it wasn't like it was expressed in her life other than going to the Yiddish theater or being a subscriber to the Yiddish version of the Forward. The kind of experience of vibrant secular Yiddish culture had ended sometime in the 60s and 70s, and Israel as the place where Jewish life was dynamic and creative, that had kind of solidified. I mean, she was a very particular kind of Jewish nationalist, and I think I inherited some of that from her, where ideology is maybe less important than being where the Jews are. And Israel happened to be where the Jews were.
Right. Sociological nationalist, if you will.
In this way.
Demographic nationalism.
Demographic nationalist, or, you have to be with the people, kind of.
Right. You make this point that it's undeniable that there are Jews in Israel and that they will constitute a majority of world Jewry, and therefore deal with it. Jews across the world, including those inclined to be fiercely critical. But I want to just double back to what you say and think and imagine about Jews in the United States as that demographic shift from a vast majority once upon a time in the diaspora to a majority in Israel is occurring. Because there's more than a trace in your book of a narrative of decline with respect to American Jews. And it seems like you don't see much of a future outside of Haredism. And, in that regard, I'm really curious how you think of a text that you mention in your book, which is Shimon Rabidovich's classic essay, Israel, an Ever-Dying People. Because you seem to be suggesting we may be the last link in the chain of American Jewish history. So do you see this as a kind of declensionist story about American Jewry?
I would say that the narrative that I ended up writing is a moderate declensionist one. I mean, I don't think that American Jewry will be extinct or that it'll cease to exist. What I mean that the American Jewish century has ended, I mean that it has ceased to be the engine or locus of Jewish creativity, political thinking. It's more about the stasis, a kind of maybe even a decay or a decadence, that might be the better word, of American Jewish life rather than its disappearance. I mean, I actually started the book wanting to disprove the declensionist narrative. There are obviously in the organized Jewish world a lot of maybe even the dominant, like a lot of people, maybe even the dominant strain of American Jewish life that kind of looks out on the flock of American Jews and finds them wanting. And then this is kind of the intermarriage continuity crisis discourse. And I tried to avoid that as much as possible in the book because I think it's a symptom rather than a cause of anything.
Well, let me just jump in. I mean, because part of what you critique is, this materialism and a kind of superficiality and sort of a lack of depth. But the story often reads as well as a critique of the liberal idea, the idea of liberalism as well. I wonder if you can really relate to that. I mean, do you think that we have reached the end not just of sort of American Jewish decadent materialism, but the liberal ideal of personal autonomy and choice that has been so formative in the American Jewish experience and in the modern Jewish experience more generally, whose alternative is the collectivism embodied by the Jewish presence in Israel?
I mean, I think American Judaism has pushed liberalism to the limit, and it's now begun to fragment the communities that were able to previously flourish. And I think in the book, I try to make it clear, I think political liberalism in terms of a neutral public sphere and is indispensable to Jewish flourishing, certainly in the diaspora. But when those precepts are taken into the realm of religion, I don't think that American Jews have been able to come up with any coherent sort of reasons for being Jewish other than kind of subjectivist, voluntarist reasons or even hedonistic ones. I mean, if you ask most American Jews who do participate in Jewish life, now we're already talking about a minority of American Jews, they might say things like, it makes me feel good, or it's not operating according to a rationale, say, that we might find as a recognizable theological one, like divine command, or even less of a theologically imposing one of more, this is what it means to belong to a culture or a people. That might be more common. But even then, I don't think that if you go to your average American synagogue, you'll find very much thought about why people are doing what they're doing. And it's that is sort of what I mean by the decline. That was the thing that was most disappointing to me, because I really set out at the beginning of the book wanting to write a progressive defense of liberal Jewish life against the right-wing naysayers who I saw 3 years ago as both my opponents politically in terms of what's happening in Israel, and I thought in the realm of religion. And I was really disappointed actually during the years that I reported and kind of explored the texture of what was out there in terms of active liberal Jewish life.
One sees that tension, I think, in the book because, for example, you critique the ethos and discourse of survivalism, the ethos of Schreien Gewalt at the imminent decline of American Jewry, and yet, in some sense, you're a neo-survivalist, right? You're saying, we may be the last link in the chain, or this is a culture on the verge of implosion, which has been a recurrent trope in modern Jewish history. And I should add, which very often was followed by attempts to rejuvenate, regenerate, undertake a renaissance of Jewish culture. That is to say, the anxiety over the prospective disappearance. But in this case, it seems to me you are borrowing that survivalist fear. No?
I mean, I would say that I'm almost even more pessimistic than the survivalists. I would try to get at this a little bit in the conclusion. The survivalists imagine a kind of catastrophic rupture, the vanishing, the disappearance. This is where there are analogies to, a second Shoah with assimilation, whatever they want to call it. I don't think there will be any cathartic moment at which American Jewish life will vanish, disappear, implode. I think actually even more, to me, more dispiriting is that it could kind of plod along in its suburban stability and insulation from hard questions and from substance for a very, very, very long time. The institutions are well endowed and can last for many decades. They'll probably outlive all of us. So I hear what you're saying about there is, and the neo-survivalists, maybe if I were to critique myself, there's like a vitalist current where I want Judaism to be active. I want it to be, I want it to fight for what it believes in. And I don't think that that's what American Judaism is doing.
Well, just a very simple question. Why is it so important that Jewish life continues to flourish? I mean, Jews themselves in America continue to do well, relatively. What is it? I mean, and this golden age, this Jewish American century, perhaps was the right thing for many people for some times, but maybe it isn't anymore. I mean, it's not like it seems like sometimes there's this sense of urgency to impose like content and substance on people who are just not interested in it. So why do you think, to you personally, why is it so important? And also, I would like to ask you, maybe this is a separate question, I don't know, maybe to look at it in this broader context of really a cultural crisis that has gripped the entire United States, not just the Jewish community. And one of the symptoms of this decline is really Jews losing their distinctiveness. And maybe that is really the problem with assimilation, is that the Jews are assimilating into a broader culture in crisis.
Whether American Jews are assimilating into a broader culture in crisis or they're influenced by it, I mean, either way, I mean, I agree. Like I think I write this in the book. I don't think it's clear to me that what's happening in American Jewish life in the United States is a symptom of what is happening in American life more broadly. It's not only synagogues whose membership rolls are declining. This is also true of churches. It's part of the broader fragmentation of associational life. I mean, this is the kind of bowling alone story, but I think we live in a version of it kind of on steroids now with social media and just a kind of incoherent, fragmented public sphere. It's very hard to get people to, come together in any sort of form of communal activity. I mean, to me, the reason why this is important is because I believe that community is a good, and that as I, ended up arguing at that towards the end of the book, that I think that traditional Jewish community is the best way to actualize that good for Jews. So if American Jews aren't able to build sustainable communities or live in, as you might say, like thick communal life, then I think that's a problem. But you're also right that we like maybe I argued with my parents a lot about this book. They were very ambivalent about it, the family story part. And one of the things that came up when they only read it very late in its writing, and one of the things that I think it was probably my mom. It's like, why are you so judgmental? Kind of to say, like, what if it's okay for people to just kind of not live very self-critical, engaged lives. But I happen to think that an engaged, self-critical life is a better one than a life lived kind of sliding through the different stations that one experiences. It's actually the ability to say, no, I think this form of life is better than another, that I think people have become unable to do that largely as a result of what they take to be the liberal value of tolerance. And this kind of live and let live relativism, which is very, very common, I think, in liberal Jewish communities. Like, if you ask some people, like, I only do this and I only do that, and you ask them why, it's like, I like it better. Teach them. There's this value of non-judgmentalness, which I think there's a lot of good things about it, but I think it also has this flip side, which is that it makes a certain kind of thick living together very, very difficult to sustain.
It seems to me where you end up going, Josh, is to two possible antidotes to that liberal ethos that leads to relativism and the sort of dilution of Jewishness. One of which you just mentioned, which is the thick culture of a traditionally observant life, and the other, which may be surprising to readers given your recent journalistic output, is what you call the inescapability of Israel. Sort of two forms of, we might say, collective Jewish identity that are essential to the survival and flourishing of the Jewish community. And there's an irony in that, given the fierceness of your critique of the Israel Project, given that you devote a large section of the book to what you call the complete Zionization of American Jewish culture, of which you're not just an observer, but critical. So it's sort of one of the features of the book that you attack some of the very tensions and contradictions that you embody. So I wonder if you could unpack, particularly the Israel piece, the inescapability of Israel, as something you see as necessary for Jews to acknowledge in order to recapture that vitalist sensibility.
Two things came to mind as you were asking that question. The first is that the book is, as much as I am critical of the American Jewish community, of Israel, it is, and as I've understood my work, coming from the inside, so to speak. It's been important to me to speak to other Jews in the American Jewish community, even if I haven't always done that successfully. And part of my cheshbon nefesh over the last 9 months has been to sort of recalibrate to what extent I wasn't doing that successfully, or maybe even ethically. But when I talk about the inescapability of Israel, I mean, my thinking on that emerged in some sense out of a critique of a milieu that I also had familiarity with, which is sort of the left-wing, neo-diasporist one in New York. And it occurred to me that what they were saying made no sense. And what I mean that what they were saying made no sense was that they wanted a concept of Jewish peoplehood, but they wanted it to be almost a Jewish peoplehood that ignored the existence of Israel. It's like, we want Jewish peoplehood, we want Jewish cultural nationalism, but actually the thing that those other Jews who are actually more numerous than us over that, we don't want anything to do with it. And I think that is I think that's wishful thinking. And the reason why it's wishful thinking is that, as anyone who has been active in kind of diaspora politics can tell you, your life, even in the diaspora, is determined in a lot of ways by what happens in Israel. The possibility of your political coalitions can be derailed by one comment from a minister who says something crazy like Amichai Shikli. Like, it's not in a way that I think I used to find extremely frustrating and wanted to kind of separate or divorce or achieve some kind of a diaspora autonomy. At a certain point, I was like, no, that's a way of trying to shirk responsibility for this broader Jewish collectivity that I am a part of, whether I like it or not. I don't always like political analogies that rely on the family, but I think the family in some ways is a good one here. There might be people in my family who believe things that I find reprehensible. Fortunately, there are not that many, but I recognize them as my family. I feel responsibility for them. I mean, that was another thing that I felt didn't make sense to me about the time that I spent in the left-wing milieu in the States, which is that the rhetoric of political mobilization actually relies on a rhetoric of responsibility. Those Jews in Israel are doing something bad. I feel implicated, responsible, etc. So therefore, I must protest here. But the cultural program and on the other hand, their argument was saying they are not us. And I felt there was a tension between the sense of responsibility, which I think is a good one and is right, and the kind of direction of disavowal. I think these have become two separate directions in the politics of kind of diaspora Jewish leftism.
But they all derive really from the very imbalanced power relations between Israel and the Jewish diaspora. And this is, of course, comes back to the extreme Zionization of the Jewish diaspora and perhaps some efforts to shed that. The question is really, how do you think these diaspora Jews should deal with Israel now? I mean, there are essentially two ways. One is to accept Israel as the dominant power within Jewish politics worldwide, and that is something that more and more liberal and left-wingers refuse to do with great reason. And the other thing is really to try and carve out some way of identifying without identifying too much, sort of like to tame a lion that refuses to be tamed. How do you see that happening?
How do I see it happening descriptively?
Yeah, I mean, even conceptually. I mean, how do you carve out that space for the inescapability of Israel, as you put it, that would not, drown all of them like a tide?
My answer to that question ended up being found through my experiences in the Haredi world, which we all know is also influenced by Israel, and there's an Israelicization both of American Haredi communities and also obviously of Haredi life in Israel. But I think there's a reason why those communities, certainly in the United States, have been much more insulated from some of these hard questions, which is that they developed a Jewish identity that actually didn't depend on the state of Israel. And that's an option, I think, that is still one could still hold out for secular, diaspora, progressive people. But then the question is, well, what is the alternative? And there's a macro story here too, which is also about the collapse of 20th century ideologies. Part of why secular Yiddishism was survived and part of why it died was that it was attached to a socialist political project in a lot of ways. And the death of that project doesn't happen at the same time as the death of secular Yiddishism, but they're related. This big thing of Jewish modernity also involves the 20th century ideologies. We live at a time where there aren't any more great ideologies. So it's not like there's something easily on hand to become a new foundation or a new kind of synthesis. I think there is an emergent sort of one which I really disagree with, because I think it's strategically and ethically wrong, which is a kind of Jewish politics of deference. Basically, this is an American phenomenon fundamentally, that
deference to
people perceived as of more oppressed people, which is that what does it mean to be Jewish? The ethical core of being Jewish, it is to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, even if that means being at odds with the vast majority of other Jews in the world. And I think that I want to hold a productive place where those things are in tension, that one side isn't surrendered at the expense of the other. So I don't want to be with the people who are like, you're either with the Jews, the majority of the Jews, or you're against them, and any attempt to balance a sort of universalist ethic with concern for your particular belonging is, beyond the pale. But I also don't want to be with the side that says, that views the essence of Judaism as only universalism, and then leaves no place for particular commitments.
In this regard, I'm just wondering, as I think of what I see as your kind of neo-communitarianism, a version of survivalism, a neo-traditionalism. I'm wondering, it's in some sense the elephant in the room, or the question that's been lurking for a long time, certainly throughout much of the reading of the book and even our conversation, and that is October 7th. You seem to have experienced, I mean, in the immediate aftermath, a very shocking awakening, a new realization that your erstwhile comrades on the left did not share your sensibilities, your stance as a Klal Yisrael Yid, as a Jew who has deep compassion for all Jews of many different political and religious sensibilities, and that Israel really stood at the center of the Jewish world. So can you talk about the impact of October 7th, both on you personally and on the writing of this book?
I guess I'll work backwards and start with the book. I mean, the manuscript was actually set to be due right before October 7th. And when it happened, my first reaction was, I can't deal with this right now. I'm just going to write a author's note at the beginning and just we'll send it in. And fortunately, my editor said to me, "You cannot do that. This is going to be big. This book is going to come out after, and you have to change it." I ended up writing close to 20,000 words new in the book. The entire chapter 6, I believe it is, that begins with A.B. Yoshua's speech to the AJC, was not in the book. And part of the rewriting stemmed from the very indeed visceral reaction that I had on October 7th, feeling very close to some of the people who were killed. You know, I'm getting added to the Facebook groups to kind of locate where Vivian Silver is. I'm connected in different ways. There are other people who I also had, no more than 1 degree of separation. And then on the other hand, the political home that I had sort of defaulted to in the States had no room for that experience at all. And the message seemed to me to be like, if you actually want to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, you have to accept that this is going to happen. That people who you know, or that you could have known, or that are in your social world might be killed. And like, I just couldn't accept that as an acceptable politics, not ethically and not strategically. Ethically, I think it's obvious. Strategically, part of it was, well, I thought that this project that I understood to be the Jewish left was about changing the politics of Jewish life in the United States. It's going to be very hard to get other Jewish people who are not already ideologically sympathetic to join with you when you're basically saying your brother or your cousin or these people that you know, a cost of the political project of Palestinian freedom might be them getting killed. And then there was my reaction, and there was the reaction to my reaction, which I think pushed me even and further out of where I'd been before, which was that no critique is acceptable right now, just by virtue of my expressing openly my discomfort with where the rhetoric of the movement that I thought I had been part of for a long time, just by virtue of that fact, that was considered beyond the pale by a lot of people.
And how does that figure, Josh, in your overall assessment of the fate of American Jewry? Because you state that in the book that you ended up at the end more pessimistic than when you began, and I'm wondering, how did October 7th color that overall framing?
In my darkest moments, I feel that the whole project of the American Jewish left, this millennial Jewish experience that the book kind of charts, kind of say from roughly the Occupy moment to the present, has failed. The attempt to balance universalism and particularism, to oppose the occupation, but do so in a way that spoke to other Jews and could convince them. I don't know if that project will survive.
So let's play out your neo-traditionalism. What does that actually look like? You talk about your own immersion in the Haredi community in Lakewood, and how enriching that was, how it provided a sense of thick culture and community, scaling that up to the level of American Jewry. What might that look like? I mean, you offer prescriptions in the book, or you sort of push towards the prescriptive. So now's the opportunity to play it out.
The prescriptive is in my most uncomfortable realm these days. There are other people. I'm certainly not alone in thinking what I think and feeling what I think. And there are people who are trying to organize, say, traditionally observant Jews who are also opposed to the occupation and opposed to the war, both in America and of course.
We should mention them. Smola Emuni, the Halachic Left.
Exactly. Smola Emuni is a project that I'm involved with here, and I'm less involved with the Halachic Left, but that's just how I ended up getting connected to things. So there are people who are trying to do this. It's small, but I think that those groups give me hope to the extent that I feel hope. But I think and maybe this is one lesson that I've drawn from the last, say, 9 months of experiences is that is just a degree of humility, and that it might take a little bit of time to figure out where to go from here. I mean, I came from a place of immense ideological certainty, and a lot of the things that I thought turned out to be wrong. I don't think in my analysis, say, of like the mechanisms of the occupation, but say in my understanding of who potential allies were, in my understanding of American domestic politics, and my understanding of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's something that if I would have written, there would have been much more about in the book if I had started writing it now. How to live in a world where it does feel frightening to be a Jew in a way that I had not experienced before. Something that doesn't feature into the book, but is something that I need to figure it out. At the same time, there's a part of me that wants to call, that wants to be a kind of, that wants to give the manifesto sort of statement and say we should all start communities that are that keep Shabbat and that tie the 10th of our salaries, and there's no reason why it's only Haredi communities that have this incredible social welfare safety net, that mutual aid, and there's no shortage of resources in the American Jewish community. We could be helping not just ourselves, but the broader community. I mean, that's one of my critiques of the original survivalist ideology, is that it closed its doors, or it's closed its moral horizons to only look at how it could help Jews instead of helping other people as well as Jews. But I'm trying to stay away from like calls to action these days.
So are you still hopeful? I mean, do you see a chance where like a thirst among people to reverse that tendency towards fragmentation and polarization and really go back to the more like, safer places of, community, etc.?
It's hard to say. It seems like there's a lot of energy that is moving towards fragmentation, a kind of expectant even. We can, could do a whole psychoanalysis of the whatever libidinal forces that are leading people towards polarization. I don't see any way of that broader trend stopping. I mean, this is what I'm about to say might get me in ideological trouble, but I'll bring it up with a big preface of that, saying that I don't agree with almost anything that a person like the right-wing conservative thinker Rod Dreher says. But he wrote this book called The Benedict Option, which got a lot of press in kind of the right-wing world. It's not his vision of the world, is the photo negative in a lot of ways of mine. But I think what I share in some sense with other people who are traditionally inclined is the sense of this might be the time to just seek refuge, to step out, abstain in a way. I think when I think about some of what the instrumental value of the traditional Jewish life that I talk about in the conclusion, it's that it puts one at a distance from these currents in American life. This is what I some of the things I admire most about Haredi life is like they don't watch TV. They're right about that. And I'm actually like a huge anti-TV extremist. This is one of my pet causes. But I'm belittling it now, but I really mean that I think that if you're serious about these influences in the outside culture being pernicious, and you don't see a way of reversing them because the people who want to do it are a very small majority of people, then you have to start thinking about a certain kind of separatism, almost.
So let me maybe just pose a final question that's based on a kind of a tension that you've just put your finger on by articulating this neo-Dreherian vision of a kind of retreat to what the German sociologist Tönnies called the idea of the Gemeinschaft, the holistic, organic, separatist community that sort of opts out of the automatized, robotic flow of modern life. It's a very appealing ideal, and it's, in fact, instantiated in communities like Lakewood or Kiryas Yol, which I know a bit more about. But at the end of the book, you say the following: when we cease to fight, we begin to die, which kind of brings us back to the animating and vitalizing effects of fractiousness within the community. So how do we square these two ideals, kind of the placid, organic holism of Lakewood and sort of the cacophony of dissent that is so characteristic of Jewish history, especially in the golden age of Jewish ideology from the early 20th century?
I don't think that Gemeinschaft is, and we know this from bad historical examples, is incompatible with the fighting spirit. It just might mean that you have to wait it out until a more opportune time. I think this is also true. Say there's certainly a political quietism that one finds in Haredi life, but there is also a certain fighting spirit that Haredi communities are the protectors of a tradition that's besieged, actually. And so what's happening inside that community, a community that maybe has more modest political horizons, is actually a rear guard. Is a defense, is kind of a last. It's still a battle. It's just not one that might be. It's just one that might not be winnable. I mean, one other thing I'll say also, and I appreciate raising these tensions because they are tensions that I also noticed in the book, and I wish in retrospect maybe I would have clarified them more. But I don't think of the American Jewish century as actually a golden age. And this is something that I wish I had drawn this out more. It's not this is going to sound maybe even like too cheap, but it's not the golden age. It's the age of the golden calf. It's the moment when American Jews gave up on coming up with something thicker, more meaningful, more intentional, and either said, we don't know, we're not interested in religion, we'll farm it out to Israel, and Israel will take us care of what being Jewish means for us, or we'll basically, come up with a very sort of shallow one and say, like, what's your Judaism? Oh, it's bagels and lox. Like that, to me, that's not the golden age. That's a disaster. It happened to also coincide with the most comfortable and most safe that American that maybe Jews ever were. And so perhaps it's a trade-off that was worth having. But I don't think of, unlike, say, Frank Foer, who wrote this article in The Atlantic about the end of the golden age of American Jewry, I don't look at it as a golden age in the same way. So, I did just say that I thought it was maybe like a time for humility and uncertainty, but that also doesn't mean not fighting for the things that one holds dear and important. It just means, I don't know, perhaps having a greater perspective about those things.
Okay, very well. Joshua Leifer, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also many thanks to you, David, and to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 1,000 interviews by now, probably even more. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.